Welcome back to The Right Side. In this next segment, I catch up with Jillian Anderson, who is the Chief of Staff for Representative Ward, as she explains to us what session is all about. All right, Jillian, so the reason why I wanted you to come on is to talk a little bit about session. Just a nice high overview of what session is all about. So what is session?
Yeah, so what I can do for us today is walk us through our 60-day legislative calendar. The session moves at a rapid pace every year.
So session is 60 days long?
It is, yes.
Gosh, that seems so short. Yeah. Okay, so what's the point of session?
The point of session is to make, discuss, and pass laws on behalf of the people of the state of Hawaii.
Do bills come about at the beginning of session, or is it before session?
That's a misconception that a lot of people have. Most people don't think about our legislature from May to January when we're not in session. So when we start hearing about the legislature reconvening in early January, that's when people start to get their gears turning and come up with some ideas. But actually, a lot of the bill formulation happens in the fall. I would say that's when our bill drafting reaches its peak. And then all bills are actually introduced by the first week of session. So that's about the middle of January.
Right. So if, let's say, I'm a Johnny B citizen and I have a bill idea that I want to give to my rep, what's the best time to do that?
The best time would definitely be before session starts. And I know that that's hard for most people, but again, the fall or winter of the preceding year is the best time.
So in this case, for this session, September of 2024, around that time is the best time to present bills.
Yes, and every bill that is being considered this year was introduced by January 23rd. So even now we're in late February and our office is still getting some bill requests. And it's a little bit challenging to be able to say that, sorry, everything that's being considered had to be introduced a month ago.
Right. So session begins. What happens?
Well, in the beginning of session, we have these bill introductions. This year, we had over 3,000 combined between the House and the Senate. And then we start our committee hearings. So every bill is referred to committees based on what their subject matter is, whether that's agriculture, whether it's health, whether it's tourism. And each representative is on multiple committees, and they're able to sit in specific meetings to where they discuss bills of this subject matter. They hear testimony from the general public, and they're able to pass them through, usually with amendments, as they move through the process.
Right. So a bill gets heard in committee first. Am I right in saying that?
That's where we get into some technicalities. Technically, the very first time a bill is heard is on the floor, but that is usually just part of the procedure. There's no discussion. The first discussion where we actually look at the contents of the bill is in committee. Right.
So then it goes through a committee. And am I right in saying that it doesn't just go through one committee? It might go through multiple committees. Is that correct?
It depends on the subject matter of that bill. So there are some single referrals. Usually that has to do with bills that have financial components or are of a judiciary nature. But then there's some that can have 3 or 4 committees. So it really just depends on how complex that bill is.
So when a bill goes through committee, they vote and they say, yes, let's move it along. It's not necessarily a bill yet. Or a law, I should say, a law yet.
No, and that's where, when we say that things are passing, that's just our internal terminology to say that it passed through a committee or it passed through a floor vote, but that doesn't mean that it passed and it became law. That doesn't happen until much later when that gets to the governor's desk.
Right. So a bill goes through, it could go through multiple committees, and then does it go to the floor for a final vote? Is that correct?
It's kind of a bounce back and forth, and that's probably the best way to think about how this works. So our chambers are physically in this building in the basement, and our committees are on the 3rd and 4th floor for the House and 2nd for the Senate. So if you think about it, things bounce from the chamber up to committee, back to the chamber, back to committee, and it continues through that process. So kind of think of it like a bouncing ball. Between every committee, there is a floor vote, and that's where all the members vote. And then when it goes up to committee, it goes to that smaller group based on the subject matter.
Right. And so in a committee, there are representatives. How many are there? And explain the chair and the vice chair and that.
So every committee has a equal proportion between our minority and majority members, so an equal representation of Republicans and Democrats. What a lot of people are starting to figure out is that there is a lot of power vested in the chair of every committee. So even though your local representative might be on a committee, if they're not a chair or vice chair, it's very hard for them to exert influence. It's hard for them to have a bill scheduled for a hearing, even if it's their own bill on a committee that they sit on. That doesn't mean that the chair is going to approve it to be heard. And also, the chair right now has unilateral power to choose to defer a bill. So that means if a bill passes through committee, every single member votes if they want to pass it through. But if the chair wants to not pass it, that can be their sole decision and no one else gets a say.
So that's frustrating. You've got people that come in and they want to give testimony. For instance, the hot bill right now is HB 1118, right? You had 2,000 people that were against it, about 100 plus that were for it. And yet the chair and I guess they made a vote and they voted to pass it on, even though they had so much testimony against it. How did that happen? How come the chair has that much power?
In this case, it wasn't necessarily the chair, actually, because it did have a vote of all the members of that committee. So right. The chair put it on an agenda, which usually is a sign that the chair likes that bill, sees that maybe some amendments can be made. But usually if a bill is on an agenda, that's already one hurdle to have crossed with the chair and vice chair. In this case, the vice chair, I believe, was voting with reservations. So There was a little hesitancy there. Our 2 Republican members did vote against that bill, and I believe that that's a conversation that we're having elsewhere during this hour. Yeah. At the end of the day, we really do encourage the public to come out. We say that your voice matters. We say that come and testify, and it's going to impact the decisions of our committee members. And in this case, it was a very blatant example that sometimes that's just not the case. And it'll be very interesting to watch as this bill moves forward to see how much the voices of the public do matter. Because in this case, you would say that their stance was very, very clear, and for it to still pass was very disappointing, regardless of the subject matter, regardless of how controversial this was. This is just the process in action, and it didn't work the way it should.
Yeah, it feels like the people are not being heard.
Yes.
Or their voice is not, it doesn't matter. So we are at the end of February. And we are coming to something that's called crossover. Tell us about that. What does that mean?
Yeah, crossover is exactly what it sounds like. So the House introduced their own bills. Those are called House bills. The Senate introduced their Senate bills. And at this time, every bill has been in its chamber. So the House has been hearing their bills and vice versa. But now we're reaching a period of time where the House is going to be giving all their bills over to the Senate, and the Senate's going to be giving all their bills over to the House. And then the process will repeat itself. The House will hear all the Senate's bills.
It's the same thing, but now the Senate bills are over at the House and vice versa.
Yes, and that's what's interesting with a bicameral legislature is that even though they're one body and it needs to pass through both the House and the Senate to get to the governor, they don't hear their bills at the same time. So they're heard separately, they're considered separately. Each chamber can make their own amendments to the same bill. So there's a little bit of a power struggle. And we're going to start to see now the House seeing what the Senate's been working on for the last month and a half, and the Senate will be seeing the same of the House's. Right.
And then what happens after that? Do they all come together?
Yes, and that I'm sure will be the topic of conversation as we hit late April here on this station. But we'll be having something called conference, and that will be a very hectic period of time where the House and Senate will sit on opposite sides of a table, literally, and they will work through differences in the 2 versions of the same bill. And at that point, they'll come out with one conference draft that will be the compromise bill of what both houses have decided.
So a bill will change throughout
Absolutely.
Session. And there will be amendments and so forth. But the changes are pretty minimal, or could they be pretty intense?
That depends. In most cases, they're minimal changes. In a few years ago, actually, we had a Supreme Court ruling where you can no longer do something called gut and replace because we were seeing massive changes to bills.
Explain that.
Yeah, so every bill has a title. So previously it could be something very broad, like relating to education, relating to taxation. And as long as the substance of the bill had to do with that title, you were legally fine. But because they were using such broad titles, that gave a lot of broad authority throughout the session to be able to completely gut an original idea from January. And by the time you saw that bill in April, it wasn't even recognizable. And again, we have votes happening all throughout the session. So one rep could be voting yes on something in February, and then all of a sudden now by April, it's a completely different bill. So it just made everything so much more confusing, and it allowed for more funny business throughout the process. So the Supreme Court ruling saying you can't gut and replace the content now limits it a bit. We want to have titles that are a little bit more specific, and we also want to be able to make sure that we're not seeing massive changes of the bill throughout.
So how many sessions have you been in?
This is my fourth session, which in session years is pretty equivalent to dog years. I feel like I've been here much longer than I actually have.
How would you describe this year's session so far?
This session, I think, actually, with new leadership, I think it's a lot of the same ideas, unfortunately, and that's what I find every session I'm here, you think this is going to be the year that we finally pass this. But again, it's oftentimes a lot of conversation without actually seeing these bills come to fruition, and that's just sadly how things work with such a limited time period that we have to discuss, and how every 2 years our House members change out. But I do see that there's maybe attempts for more transparency this year, and a little bit more in terms of having the minority bills get a fair shake.
Right, because some of them are actually moving along, still alive, so to speak.
Yeah, which is rare in previous years.
Yes, that's great. How would you encourage those that are listening that are not involved in politics? Maybe, I know that there are a lot of people who have given up on politics because they just feel like their voice isn't being heard. What would you say to that person?
I think it's important to differentiate what's going on in national politics and global politics from local politics. Because if you're looking at that national conversation, it's very easy to get weary and to think that it's too big to get involved with. But our local government is extremely accessible. And these are people who are looking at issues that affect you and your daily lives. So I think that if you take the time to see who's your local representative, who's your local senator, most of you listening probably don't even know that. So
how can they find out?
There's a very easy tool I would recommend through our legislative website, which is capital.hawaii.gov. If you click on Find Your Legislator, all you do is put in your home address, and you'll see a very easy map that'll show you who your senator and representative is and all their contact information. But I think that it's important to understand that this is really not a building that deals with partisan issues and deals with those bigger substantive things. We're looking at things that affect you in your own backyard. Sometimes it's as minute as even discussing a certain road. So government can be something that's intimidating and can be something that's frustrating at the slow pace that it moves. But really, at the end of the day, everyone in this building works for you, and it's important to be involved in that.
Yes, but it's funny that I find that you see here in the building, there are certain representatives or senators that will stand up for something or cause something that's very controversial. Do you think that's just a political thing, a political move to be known?
I'd honestly like to see more of that. I feel like I am witnessing the opposite problem where a lot of people aren't standing up, that there's a lot of silent representatives. And it would be nice to see people get up and be able to speak out on issues, whether in support or opposition, but to have more debate, I think is really what we need in this building.
So do you believe that it's a very, do you believe that here in Hawaii, it's not a very balanced power government because there's so many Democrats versus Republicans? I mean, there's only 8 or
9.
Technically 9. And, the total of 51, what's 9 minus 8? There's 41 Democrats.
42 versus 9.
42?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm terrible at math. But what does that do? What does that say to you?
In recent years, that's actually a high number. When I first started working here just 4 years ago, we only had 4 Republicans.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And we had 6, and now we have 9. So it actually sounds like a big number.
Right.
I personally don't know how much the party affiliation has much to do with it. I think a lot of it just comes down to these internal power dynamics. If you're a chair, if you're a vice chair, if you're in leadership versus what party you're in.
Do you think that will ever change? Do you think the power of the chair and vice chair may be better balanced?
I think we absolutely need to make major reforms in terms of the chair's power. I think that we need to be able to have our members of committees, for example, actually be able to have influence on their committees, determine what bills get on agendas, and to be able to also determine what bills are deferred. And if there is a deferral, have clear reason as to why. I think that in the committee structure and the chair structure, there's a lot of room for reform. And this year we did have a more transparent and open conversation than we ever had before. But moving forward, hopefully under Speaker Nakamura, we'll be seeing more of that.
So let's get back to conference. So from what I understand, once the reps go to conference, no one really speaks up or has a voice unless they are a chair or vice chair. Is that correct? And what's the point of that?
That's actually in the rules. They're not called chairs at that point. They're called conveners, I believe, or co-conveners. It's been a year, so
yeah.
It gets a little bit hairy as time goes on. But it actually does state that if you're in conference, if you're not one of those main individuals, that you can't speak other than saying yes or no.
When you're saying yes or no, is that a vote?
That is the vote, yes.
Okay.
So when you're sitting at that table, you can't have conversation regarding the amendments, regarding the substance of the bill, what changes need to be made. You're just basically told, here's what was oftentimes discussed behind closed doors. Now we're in the public view. We're on YouTube. We have some people in the room. Here's what we propose as the House. Here's what the Senate proposes. We're agreeing either on the Senate's draft, the House's draft, or a combined draft, which is called that conference draft. And then the remaining members of that conference committee are asked yes or no.
So if a bill makes it through to conference and they're voting, do those bills, what's the percentage of those bills that move on to the governor's desk, would you say?
That's been a little bit unusual in recent years. We had an incident about 2 years ago where we were really up against tight deadlines, and we had some issues with our financial committees giving clearance, and many bills died. Entire slates of topics died just because we couldn't hit a 6 p.m. deadline. So recent history has proven itself. It's a little bit hard, even if all your ducks are in a row, to be able to get out of conference just because it moves so quickly. But if it does get to conference and there is a legitimate conversation, a very high likelihood it's going to pass that final vote and get to the governor. And then really the only thing stopping it then from becoming law is if there is some legal aspect that is in question.
Is that handled by the governor's office?
Yes, typically the attorney general, I believe, gives those recommendations.
Okay, great. So it goes through the attorney general as well and just make sure that it's right.
As advisory, yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Jillian, for your time and giving us a good overview of what happens. And we're looking forward to the crossover, and let's see what happens. Hopefully we'll have you back at the end and we could talk a little bit more.
Sounds great. Exciting times ahead.
Yes.